Hey there, I'm so pumped to tell you about an amazing new community I've launched called Grief to Growth Circle Community. It's a space for people who are grieving to come together to support each other, and for people who want to know who we are, why we're here, and where we're going to have those conversations, all the things we talk about on the podcast. So I invite you to join me at grieftogrowth.com/community to become part of this compassionate crew. The best part, it's 100% free. And you have access to me in addition to everybody else in the community. In fact, the podcast will be there so you can talk about the things we talk about in the podcast right there in the community. There's also some premium content if you want to go deeper in the work I'm doing, but mostly it's about building relationships and community and about sharing resources and supporting each other. So come on over and check it out. It's grieftogrowth.com/community. I'll see you inside. Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hi there. Welcome to another episode of Grief to Growth. My name is Brian Smith. If this is your first time joining us, we talk about the complexities of life. We unravel the mysteries of our existence, and we explore how to navigate the most challenging moments of life. And whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a longtime listener, I'm grateful to have you with us. Today, we've got a remarkable guest. Her name is Natasha P. Trujillo. She's the author of the compelling book, And She Was Never the Same Again. She's also a respected therapist with a wealth of experience in helping individuals and families through grief and trauma. Her expertise and insights will provide invaluable guidance on a range of topics today, from debunking the widely misunderstood 5 stages of grief to understand the profound impact of trauma on our perception and resilience. So in today's episode, we're going to dive deep into how grief evolves over time, why it manifests differently for each of us, and some practical strategies for supporting aging loved ones while creating meaningful impact. Tasha will also share tools for navigating life's gains and losses, ways to balance future goals with present challenges, and a personal journey through health and survival during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all remember very well. So join us as we uncover the myths, explore the truths, and equip you with the knowledge to better understand and manage grief and trauma. And don't forget afterwards to continue the conversation at grieftogrowth.com/community. So with that, I want to welcome Tasha Trujillo.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have the conversation with you today. This is kind of what we talk about here is grief and trauma and all those fun topics that people love to discuss. To start off, I'd like to ask you, what inspired you to write the book?
A couple of different things. So by trade, I'm a counseling and sports psychologist. And when I was getting my doctorate in counseling psych, I was on a grief and loss research team. And so I've always kind of been fascinated with it and kind of submersed in the grief and loss world. And I'd written in academia. Writing in academia is very different than writing a book, of course. And so I'd always kind of had the idea, but it was more of an afterthought and just wanted to get my career going and that sort of thing. And then in about a period of around 7 months, I had 2 just very, very impactful losses, probably the most significant of my life up to this point. And even though I specialize in grief and loss, and I kind of do it day in and day out, and I have a lot of the intellect and the education and the knowledge, I was just really struggling, and I needed to find a way to express myself and just work through it in a way that what I was trying to do at the time was not working. So that was really the premise of the book. It was sort of that intellectual still pursuit for things, but also my own personal experiences that brought it together.
Wow. So you were in the grief field before you experienced these griefs, which I find always really interesting because a lot of people that I talk to, like myself, we get into this after we experience a big loss. So do you know what inspired you to go into grief? Because most people want to stay as far away from it as possible.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd say this is a both and for me, right? There was grief and loss that kind of started my life and my existence. And so it had always kind of been there. And I learned from a very young age, and I address this in the book. The second chapter is about I had a flight for life when I was just under 3 years old. I was in full respiratory failure, was born healthy, and then just kind of out of nowhere within a period of 24 to 48 hours was in full respiratory failure. They did not
Mm.
expect me to live. And so that experience, right, fundamentally changed my life and my parents' lives and my extended family's life. And so I think that combined with being part of a very big Mexican family, one of the downsides of having a really big family in that way is that you experience a lot of death. There's a lot of people. So
Mm.
those people also have to die at some point as well. So it's kind of that combination of experiences when I was a kid that always led me into it, was very fascinated. And then of course, these two bigger significant events that really prompted the book. I think it all just kind of came together, and it was the right moment to bring the book to life.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point about the event you had when you were young, because we often associate grief, and I think we usually do, with the loss of a person, but grief can come from other types of events, true, too, as well.
Yes, and that was one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to write the book. So, as
Hmm.
a counseling and sports psychologist, I work primarily with athletes, and the grief and loss that you experience as an elite athlete, right? We could talk about this for hours. And oftentimes it's not death losses. And even with non-athletes that I work with, we'll talk about them losing a job or having a baby or getting married or losing an identity or having an injury or just these life transitions that we go through. There is loss, both gains and losses associated with those, and we don't often call it grief or feel like we are grieving or feel like we have permission to grieve
Hmm.
because there isn't a death associated with it. So that was a huge reason for me writing the book, is to make sure that each chapter focuses on a different type of loss. Some are death related, some are not death related, but just to show that diversity and that variety in our life experiences and encourage people to look at it from that grief and loss lens.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because because there are all these different types of losses, sometimes people feel like, well, this isn't really grief, and I'm not really allowed to mourn this, and I can't talk because this is not a big deal. People will say to me like, well, you lost a daughter, so this is nothing compared to that, and then people feel like that isn't, then they don't have the right to say I'm grieving.
Yes. Oh, and I think the comparisons, again, another reason why I wanted to write the book, there is not just one way to grieve. And it gets really challenging when we start to compare losses
Mm.
or feel like, oh, well, I can't do this because this didn't happen to me, or I shouldn't be feeling this because that didn't happen to me, or it didn't go down like that. And this person's grief is worse, et cetera, et cetera. It just gets really hard. And then there's so much judgment and self-evaluation and self-deprecation, and it becomes very isolating and restrictive and constrained. And it doesn't help people work through their grief. So that was again a huge premise of me writing it, is to help people understand your journey is your journey, and it's okay. It doesn't need to be compared to somebody else's.
Yeah, and that comparison goes both ways. Sometimes people will minimize their own grief because they say it's not as big as someone else's. But I've also heard people say, like, for example, if
Yes.
someone's lost a pet, well, it was just a dog, about someone
Yes.
else.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And the language there becomes so important, right? I always talk about bad words and grief,
Mm.
at least, still, right? Some of these messages that
Right.
could be well intentioned, even, right? Like, it's okay. I just want you to feel better, but can really be invalidating and quite harmful and detrimental to the people they're directed towards.
Yeah, let's talk about that more, because when I wrote my book, I included some of those things that, just as a layperson, the things that irritated me, that when people said it. And as I've worked with people, help people understand how important language is when you're trying to console someone who's grieving, and you use things like at least or still.
Yes, yes. And I always want to start with a caveat when we have this sort of conversation, because I think part of the barrier is that people don't know what to say and they get really fearful and they feel like they have to say the right thing or that there's
Mm.
one perfect thing to say. So I always start these conversations by saying, please suspend some of those expectations, right? I'm not going to give you just one thing that you can say that's going to work in all of these situations. But I do think being aware of our language and what messages might be being sent are really important. Because when you
Hmm.
say something like, oh, at least, or you're still struggling with this or that sort of thing, we are sending this message that there are timelines or expectations, and that we, whoever's saying that, we are uncomfortable. I am uncomfortable with your grief. Why are you still struggling with that? Why are you still doing that? And so language becomes very important because you just want to communicate. I see you, I hear you. And even if I don't understand or agree with where you're at necessarily, can I still say something where you feel seen and heard and it doesn't become about me and my distress with your grief?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's great. And I think it's really important that, that you said that, because those things can be so invalidating of our grief, even I've heard people who've lost a child. Well, at least you still have another child, or you're
Yeah.
young, you can have more children, things of that nature. And they think it's helpful, but for the person that's in grief, it can be very invalidating.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You are reminding me, one of the biggest instances where I hear that talked about a lot is with miscarriage.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that comes up a lot. And then people who have miscarried feel what we call social constraint. They don't feel like that space is safe enough to talk about it, right? Like, my grief is not, it doesn't have a seat here. It's not
Yeah.
appropriate.
Yeah. I love the title of your book, and explain why you chose that title.
Oh my gosh, yes. So it's called And She Was Never the Same Again. And I picked that title for a few reasons. First of all, I thought the and was really critical to have, because so much of these grief situations end up being both and situations, not either or, right? You're either over it or you're not. No. You either still hurt or you haven't, or you don't. No. You're either in anger or in denial. No. Oftentimes it's both and when we look at these things. So that word was very, very important. It actually came to me because with the two losses that I had suffered pretty close together, I was thinking through how other people were talking about me, and I had friends and I had family that were like, you're just different now. You're just different. And so I was almost thinking about what they were saying about me when I wasn't around, and they were saying she has never been the same. She's never going to be the same again, sorts of things. So yeah, it was like 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. That phrase just came to me, and I was like, that's it. I knew the title of the book and the last line of the book before I started writing it.
Oh,
So
wow. What's the last line, if you don't mind?
uh, the last line is, and then I met her, and I was never the same again.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm testing out a new feature. I'd love to get your feedback on it. It's called Fan Mail, and you can send me a message right from the show notes of the podcast. So look for the link that says send me a text. You can ask a question for a future podcast. You can suggest a guest, or just give me any feedback you want. Just remember, it is one way. I can't text you back, and I will not have your name, your email address, or your phone number unless you include it in the message. Let me know what you think. Time for a real quick break. Make sure you like and subscribe. Liking the video will show it to more people on YouTube, and subscribing will make sure you get access to all my great content in the future. And now back to the video. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you said, you'll never be the same again, because I remember when my daughter passed away, um, thinking I like made a vow that I would always be miserable, because that was my way I was going to honor her, was just and I wanted people to say, and he was never the same again. So that was something that actually went through my mind.
Yes. Yes. And that's why that and is so important, because you will absolutely continue to have days and moments of misery, right? That's never going to go away. And you can also have moments of joy
Mhm.
and pleasure and satisfaction. It really is a both and. And I think that really speaks to the duality of life and of our life experiences. which again was a huge reason for me wanting to write the book. I really wanted to highlight the gains and losses of life events, both desirable ones and undesirable ones, and help people see the complexity with this a little bit more. Because I think the more we get into the nuances and understand how complex these things are, I think we can be a little bit more compassionate with ourselves and with other people, and a bit more understanding, and hopefully react and respond in ways that are more useful to people grieving.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you said the gains and losses, because we think of grief and we think of losses. So what would be some of the gains we might see?
Yes. And again, this is so interesting because with the book, people are like, oh God, your book must be so sad. You wrote a book about grief and loss. And I'm like, well, yeah, it definitely has some sad moments, but you see some really beautiful, powerful stuff in there too. You see some gains, you see some ways in which some of the most challenging life experiences that we've gone through as individuals and collectively have done really good things for us. And I have to be really careful with this too, because there's a time and a place to bring up gains
Yes.
after a significant loss.
Yes.
So, in the immediate aftermath of a death or of a career ending injury for an athlete, that is not the time to be like, let's talk about how you're growing right now, right? Like, we don't want to bring
Yeah.
that up.
Right. Yeah.
But in time, we're able to kind of think through, okay, that injury taught me that I can work really hard and come back from something. That death gave me the opportunity to get closer to other people in my life that I had been estranged from or hadn't put effort into, or, I realized what values were actually important to me in life, and what I wanted to do with the time I still had. So I think in time we can consider these, and I wouldn't call them positives. I do call them more gains, because we recognize our own strength and resilience and learn things about ourselves that we otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah, I think it's we recognize our own strength and resilience, and I always think about this, and we also, I think, gain strength and resilience. It kind of helps us to grow in a sense. So it's both. It's like, and I've had so many people say to me, "Well, if I ever lost a child, I could never do what you do. I would just, I would crumble." And people think that's the case until they're put in a situation.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, and to that point, we truly don't know how we are going to respond until something happens. And even if
Mhm.
we've been through death before, right? It's a different person that dies every time. So it looks a little bit different. And so the complexity of that, and the conflict in that too, right? Our emotions can be very conflicted, our identities can be very inflicted, but that is all very normal and natural and part of grief.
Mhm. Yeah, and the other thing about the title, because it reminds me, like when people, when they're suffer like a really big loss and maybe it's their first one, and they just want to know, am I ever going to be the same again? When am I going to go back to normal? So, have you gotten
Yes.
that question from people you've worked with?
So much. And again, I think the title that very much plays into part of why I chose that, is because I want people to understand you aren't going to return to your former self after you suffer a loss that significant.
Hmm.
And that's okay. That's not the goal. That's not what we're trying to get back to. Because I would think from a clinical perspective, when I have people coming in to work with me as their psychologist, and those are some of their expectations, it's really hard for them to feel relief or to feel like they're moving forward, because they're not meeting those expectations.
Right, right. I think it's really important, but again, everything the message we're delivering have to be delivered very carefully, because people could get despondent when you say, "Well, what do you mean I'm never going to be the same again?" Or in
Yes.
your family, it's like, "What do you mean he's never going to be the same again?" But I tell people, why would you waste all this pain, all this growth, all these things you're going through? If you return to who you were before, then this won't have served any purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. I also talk about some of the potential freedom I try to instill in those sorts of
Mm,
conversations.
yeah.
Because again, when we feel so bound by, I must return to my former self, or I must be over this by now, we ask ourselves those questions. Why does this still bother me? Why am I still doing this? I think sometimes opening up and saying, hey, you have fundamentally changed, and that will continue to be so as your life progresses. I do think there can be a little bit of freedom in that it's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, so I got to reshape my goals a little bit. I got to think through and kind of reconceptualize and reframe what I'm trying to achieve here and what I'm trying to work through. So I found in a lot of cases, it's alleviated some of the pressure.
Hmm. I like the way you phrase that, freedom. Because society, family, people are always trying to put us in a box. They're always trying to say, this isn't like you. This isn't who you are, and so what we're saying is we're giving people it's okay. It's so you get to choose now who you are. You get to choose how you go forward. So that could be a positive or a benefit or a gain or whatever word we want to use for it. And I think it's really important for people to understand this grief will always be with you in some form. And for me, just a personal thing is like today is the ninth anniversary of my daughter's passing. And so, as I go through this process, there are times when you feel like, yeah, I kind of got this, right? I've got this now. It's been 5 years, it's been 8 years, whatever. I do this. I work with people in grief. I talk about it all the time. This is my life. But still, every June 24th, when I wake up in the morning, it's like I'm taken back to that day. And it's a little it's different every year, but it's also still the pain is still there.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you for chatting with me and having this discussion on such an important day. And yes, to your point, that I think sometimes people will, if they feel like they've taken a couple steps backward, they're like, oh, I was doing so well, and now all of a sudden I feel like it's the first day all over again, and
Hmm.
I can't seem to get it together, right? Like that is life. There are going to be things that pop up that impact us and kind of take us back to this place, and that is normal. And yes, it's exhausting and
Yeah.
it's draining and it's really, really hard, but that is part of the process. And I think that education is really important to give people too, because again, it can create a sense of freedom where it's like, okay, I get it. I can get it. Today's a hard day. Anniversaries are hard days. It's okay that I'm experiencing this a little bit different, or it's hitting me a little bit harder than it did last year or last week.
Yeah. And that's what I would that's the reason I brought it up, because I want people to understand it's okay. Because again, sometimes people, especially in early grief, I think, or often in early grief, they'll feel like they're quote doing better. And then they'll say, but then something happened and I just had a setback. And I went right back to where I was at the beginning. I'm like, no, you didn't. I know it feels that way, but you're not in the exact same place. But you are going to have those days. You're going to have those times. You're going to have those moments, and they're okay. When Shayna first passed, there was an album that I listened to like every day for like I walk every morning, and it's a really really sad album. It's just really sad, but that was the way I was feeling, and I hardly listen to that album anymore. But I did. I listened to it this morning, and I was my friends were sending me messages and stuff, and trying to give me encouragement. And I was like, should I tell them that I'm listening to this song? And I sent the song to them because I'm like, yeah, I do feel bad today, and that's okay.
Yes, yes. You're also speaking to the power of the arts, I think, too, and how important art is for grief, whether it's, written word or music or some sort of drawing, art, that sort of thing. In some ways, we are drawn to that when we're feeling that intensely because it is validating.
Hmm.
It is validating, and in some ways, it's a bit of it's a relationship with an inanimate object, so it can't quite hurt you or put you in your place in the same way, but it can allow us to feel like we are connected. We
Yeah.
are
So I
connected
would
and
let's talk about
understood.
that because it's an observation that I made. It's like sometimes you want to listen to music that lifts you up, and sometimes you want to listen to music that just like speaks to where you are. So why is that?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I think part of that is because when we are in those places, it is so lonely. It is so lonely and so isolating. And so when we can hear something that allows us to sit and be with that feeling and isn't trying to at least or still,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That isn't trying to take that away and can just let us go there and be with that. It is a sense of connection and grounding. And I think it's a great way to let us process and be with our grief, which is the only way we can go through grief, is to be with it and go through it. We can't get around it. We can't avoid it. We can distract, and that's helpful to a certain extent, but at some point we really do have to move through it. And I think, yeah, listening to sad music when you're sad can be really beneficial in that way.
Yeah, well, for me, because I want to hear your perspective from a professional perspective, but for me, it's like I feel like someone understands how I feel. Someone, it's that shared humanity, and the music. It's Amy Lee Evanescence. I love her voice. I love the songs and
Oh,
stuff.
yes,
And I
yes.
know the loss that she's been through, and it's like it makes me feel like, okay, I'm not alone in this. Someone else understands how I feel, because these are things you can't say to people. You can't tell people the
Yes.
song, particular songs we talk about. People will think you're suicidal. So it's nice to be able to just listen to it and to feel those feelings and say it's okay. And then when the song's over, the album's over, then you go about your day.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's what I was getting at with that, like inanimate, there's less risk in some ways. And again, you don't have someone telling you you're doing it wrong, or just trying to, and again, most people are very well intentioned and want to pick you up, and they care about you and they see you're in pain and they want you to feel better. But that's also, I think, a huge part of grief is that there's often not things that we can do to help someone out of it.
Yeah.
Oftentimes the best intervention is being. There's a difference between doing and being, and how we show up and how we listen and how we be alongside them can be way more impactful than quote unquote doing something that you
Yeah.
think is going to take their grief away.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because we do, as human beings, we want to help. We want other people, we want to see them feel better. Sometimes it's for our own benefit because it makes us feel uncomfortable when someone's sad. But also we want to say the right things. We want to do the right, we want to lift them up. And so again, today, and this is really interesting, we're having this conversation today because all this stuff's going on today. But I'm, my Facebook friends, they're like, oh, and they believe like I believe, that my daughter's still with me, and so people are saying encouraging things like, she's still with you. She's, hopefully you'll feel her presence today and stuff. But another one of my friends is like, she was talking about, like, she shared a song with someone, and they said, sounds like you're still in grief. And she's like, yeah, I am still in grief. I'm always going to
Yes.
be in grief. Yeah, you're right.
Yes. Yeah, yes. And I think people know that on some level, right? But it can just be met with such discomfort in the moment where it's like, ooh, I see that you're upset and I just want to make you feel better. So that's why I say it's often well-intentioned.
Hmm.
And I think this has been one of the biggest lessons I've learned as a psychologist. When I first got into this field, I was very, and I'm a former athlete myself, so I'm a go-getter, right? I'm very oriented. I'm like, what are the skills that I need to teach
Right.
people? And how do we problem solve? And I want all this stuff to be in the agenda for each and every session. And so I guess I apologize to my first set of, clients during training way back in the day. But at this point, the biggest takeaway for me has been, how can I just show up? Because I don't always have the right thing to say, and I can't always do something or say something that's going to take away the pain that my client is experiencing in that moment. But I can be with them. I can say, I see you, I am with you. This does suck. And you're not by yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to let you have your feeling.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think that's so awesome. I was listening to a meditation this morning. This called When You Must Endure. And the thing about the grief process is, I liken it to growing a plant. You can say it's like a caterpillar changing into a butterfly, whatever. And I'll tell people, if you're a gardener and you put a seed in the ground, you don't look at it every 15 minutes and say, grow, grow, grow. But we do that with grief. We're like, why aren't you over it yet? Why am I not over it yet? And we have to understand it's a process. You can't rush it. And clients will come
Yes.
in and say, I feel like I'm stuck. And I'm like, you're not stuck. You're where you're supposed to be.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.growth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it.
Yes. Yes, that sense of stuckness too. And that is part of why I wrote the book, because I know all these things intellectually, but what I was saying to myself, and I mean, still, frankly, if I'm being honest, what I still say to myself about my harder days, it is not helpful. It's very mean and it's very evaluative, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
it does not honor the, I keep using this word complexity, but man, it is just such a fitting word. It does not honor the
Yes.
complexity of what it is like to be alive.
Yeah. Everything's a mixed bag and everything's a matter of perspective. And sometimes our perspective, even people that are trained, even people that know better, sometimes our perspective gets off. Sometimes we have those sad days or whatever you want to call them. And that, but if you can accept that and not judge yourself for that, because that's what makes it even worse, is when you compound it
Yes.
by, I
Yes.
shouldn't be feeling this way.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think in my experience too, as a helping professional and as someone who's always been pretty good at solving problems and, come across pretty even keeled, and, I've kind of got some of this mostly figured out, some days are better than others. I think that was really challenging for me too, because when I did choose to emote or open up to people or speak with them a little bit about what was going on for me, it was kind of met with like, well, you're the professional, so if you can't help yourself, like, I don't really know what to tell you, sort of thing. And so
Right.
again, it was just like, yeah, I feel stuck, right? Or I feel like I'm not, and then
Mm-hmm.
it just makes you kind of question everything. So you got to meet
Yeah.
yourself with some compassion.
Well, it was like you said, to use your word complexity. This is a process. We are human beings. We're not robots. We can't just use our brains to work our way out of it. Feelings are feelings. We're going to have emotions, and that's okay. That's part of being human. And we can get into, in my community, spiritual bypassing, where we say, okay, well, everything's okay. We know that we're going to see them again. That's not a good place to do. Or we can be that very rational, logical thing that just says, well, this is not doing you any good. Just get over it, accept it, and move on. Which is the early way that they would deal with grief. They're like, they're gone, accept they're gone. Just let them go and go on with your life.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that just does not fit the human experience. And so we have to do a better job of talking about grief and educating about grief and showing some of the nuances so that people can still feel connected and supported, but also know that their process is going to look different than anybody else's. And that's fine.
Let's talk about the 5 stages of grief, which I guess I hope everybody knows by now is a myth. But why is that so persistent and so pervasive?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think once it makes its way into more mainstream sort of media, what you hear is what sticks. And it's easier for our brains to make that automatic and to not challenge it and unlearn and relearn other things.
Hmm.
It just sticks. So yes, and I think most people, even Dr. Kubler-Ross, who had created that framework initially, before she died, she definitely spoke about, hey, this is who I was actually studying. This is not the end all be all. This is not the only component. But yeah, I think that message really stuck. And I think it is easier for people to wrap their head around than it is for what you and I are talking about, right? If you hear, okay, there's 5 stages and you get over it and you move on at some point, yeah, I'd rather to subscribe to that than you and I saying, hey, this sticks with you forever and you're always going to have hard days and you got to accept both the gains and the losses in life. I think a lot of people are like, yeah, I'm gonna go over here. Those stages make more sense. This is kind of concrete. I can kind of work my way through that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I'm pretty old. So it was a long, long time ago in college. I was taking psych class, and we were taught the five stages of death and dying. It wasn't the five stages of grief. And
Correct.
somehow that got transitioned to the five stages of grief.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and unfortunately, it has done a disservice, I think, to people who have subscribed to that. But that does kind of come back to this freedom that
Mhm.
or liberation that we've been talking about a little bit, because it's really useful for clients. And I've had this experience time and time again where I will help them unlearn that and kind of see it another way. And it can be very freeing to be like, oh, okay, so I'm not pathological because I was angry and then I thought I moved to acceptance, but now I'm in denial again. Like I'm not crazy. It's like, no, you are not. So I think it can be really freeing when people have the right information and can expand their understanding.
Yeah. And do you have clients come to you and say, okay, what's your process? How are you going to fix me? Because my experience is like they want like we're going to do this on week one, and this on week two, and this on week three, and then by week six I'll be fixed.
Yes. Quick fixes. Tell me what I can do. Tell me how long this is going to take. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I'm ill in some way, so fix me.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm broken in some way, so put me back together. I also see this too a lot with anxiety, especially working with athletes and performers.
Mm.
They'll come in and they'll say, "Ooh, I can't be anxious. You got to help me get rid of it. I can't be anxious." And so both with grief and anxiety, I
Mm-hmm.
always shut them down kind of right at the beginning, and I say, "Look, if that's what you're looking for, you're probably not going to find it here, because we're not, it's unrealistic to think that we can just rid ourselves of those things, or that there's this quick fix and you meet with me for 4 hours and suddenly everything's going to go away." So I try to do a lot of education to say, hey, you and I build a connection, we build a relationship where we can get into the weeds with these things. But I can't give you a timeline. But what I can say is that I've seen this be effective in helping you adapt and adjust and know yourself a little bit better over time. And so people can pick and choose, right? Do I want to
Yeah.
subscribe to that or not?
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about the parallel with anxiety and grief, but as I think about that, and I was talking to a friend the other day who has a brain injury, and so she thinks and acts a little bit differently than other people do, and so the doctors want to give her like medication. And she was asking me my opinion, and I'm like, we want to make everybody like the same. People process things, we want everybody process things the same and think the same and talk the same and act the same. And we want to get rid of our anxiety. And I used to have terrible panic attacks. And I wanted to get rid of them, but I realized anxiety is part of life. I have to do public speaking, and I get anxious when I do public speaking, but I think almost everybody does.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, and in the context of this is true for athletes or non-athletes, but I talk about it most frequently in the athletic or performance realm. And I send this visual that when you're really anxious and you feel like you have butterflies in your stomach, right? So there are some butterflies that we probably do want to get rid of, right? If you have anxiety that is so overwhelming that it impacts functioning, yes, we want to do some work around that.
Right.
But we know from a performance perspective, research tells us that we perform best at a moderate level of anxiety.
Right.
So whether you're playing football or you're about to run in the USA track and field trials that are going on right now, or if you have to get up and give a speech, we want a little bit of anxiety. So the idea is to maybe get rid of some of the butterflies that are not so great, maybe not as pretty to look at, but we do want to keep some and help you figure out how those butterflies can fly in formation. How can you control where they're going a little bit more?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And I think that's similar for grief, right? If we consider all of the emotions and the conflict and the ways that these emotions interact and they butt heads and all those sorts of things, we're not going to get those emotions or those connections to go away necessarily, but can we figure out how we can maneuver them a little bit better, right? Maybe we got to move it just a little bit because the pressure in that one area is a little too much, but it's still going to be there, sort of thing.
Yeah, we have to learn life is messy, life is complex, and we are going to go through various emotions, and we can't get rid of all the ones that we call bad. We have to understand that they're there for a reason. They're there to I like to tell people I think they're there to teach you something. So, when you're having anger, for example, people, anger is a big part of grief. I'm like, well, why? Ask yourself, why are you angry? And some of it's probably, justified.
Yes.
So it's okay. It's
Yes.
natural.
Yes, yes. And our emotions do give us really important information. Yeah, to your point with anger, when we can identify why we are angry, if we have been wronged in some way or hurt in some way and we're feeling that anger, that's valid. That's really good, important information for us.
Yeah. Well, I have suicide is a very complex thing because there's so much around suicide. If you're a survivor, you're the person that, the other person's taken their life. And, I'll have clients say, well, I don't really want to say this, but I'm kind of mad at him. I'm mad at him for leaving me. And I'm
Yes,
like, that's okay. If you're feeling it, say it.
yes,
You're not going to hurt that person, and you've got to process that because the alternative is to just stuff it inside and say this is something I
yes,
shouldn't feel.
yes. Again, it's that both and. It's that both and. And when you do try to shove it down or bury it or deny that that part exists, it makes the process just that much more exhausting and draining and challenging. I hear this a lot too with, and I actually speak to this in the book a little bit, but with those who have had chronic illnesses and family members are kind of in this position where, of course, they don't want their loved one to die, but they're also like, it will bring some relief. And I acknowledge that, right? Like my loved one
Mm,
has suffered
yeah,
so much and
right.
there's so much guilt and there's so much shame and nobody wants to say that out loud or talk about that.
Hmm.
But that's a very normal, natural response to seeing someone you love in so much pain and have been for so long, where it's like, I get you're not wishing them dead, you're not, right? But you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, gains and losses.
Yeah, another one because it's such a prevalent thing right now is, people who are, I can say kids because again, I'm old, but people who are struggling with drugs, and they're addicted and their loved ones are watching them, taking that chance time after time, and then they overdose. And there's sometimes a sense of relief. And it's like, and then people feel guilty but it's like, well, I don't have to worry about them anymore. And
Yes.
that is a benefit. I mean, it is.
Yes, yes. And does that take away the pain and the sadness and the hurt? No.
Right.
It just shows that both exist.
Yeah, it's again, it's going back to what you said. It's not either or. It's not like I either am sad that they're gone, or I'm relieved that I don't have to worry about them anymore. But it can actually be both things at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Which again is really hard for us as humans to wrap our head around because we like to categorize. We like to make things easier in our brain so that it can just be automatic and we don't have to think that much about it.
Hmm.
And you got to think a lot about grief.
Yeah, yeah.
You got
Well,
to be with grief a lot.
I wanted to talk to you because again, we talked about other types of losses, and I noticed you talked about aging people, but also like it's really interesting. I have a friend who just retired recently, and I'm at the age where my friends are, a lot of my friends are retiring, and I'm like in that process of evaluating, what I'm going to do. And I was talking to my wife there. I was like, we're here. We never thought we'd be here, but we're here at this point. But my friend, it was really interesting because he got a pension. He got a great buyout package, from the bank that he worked for. But he was like feeling lost, feeling
Yes.
worthless, feeling like he had been rejected. Um, have you experienced that?
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yes, this is why I think it's so important to talk about grief not just being associated with death, right? With things like retirement. And this is also, we have to think about someone's belief system and the cultural system and that sort of thing. What identities matter?
Right.
A certain culture and a certain community that this individual is a part of. because all of that, if you have been used to, and my goodness, I talk about this in athletics all the time. If your self-worth is tied to your production or your accomplishments or what you do, and then you retire, yeah, who are you? What are you doing? What is your purpose? Is there satisfaction? Is there meaning? There can be a lot of grief around that. I think it's also there's more space, there's less structure. And so you're also in a place where you're having more time to think about these things and figure out what you want to do with your time. And it can bring up a lot, and you don't have that same sort of production to strive for, to do every day. And it can be very, very displacing.
Yeah, well, I think that surprises a lot of people when they get to that point, even their own feelings about who they are. And then in fact, you have said to me, it's like, well, I don't know who I am anymore, because this is what I've done for 40 years. And people, I had to go to this place and do this thing, and now it's like, what do I do with my day?
Yes, yes. It's interesting too that you point out rejection, because I also think that is a really misunderstood or not talked about level of that sort of thing as well, with the aging process, right? When we are no longer desirable in the same way for whatever reason.
Hmm.
Yes, that rejection can be very displacing. And so when you're throwing all of the identity stuff, and then you've got some social rejection, or this perception that you are unworthy, both for yourself because you're not producing, and other people don't see as much value in you, that's a lot of grief. That's a lot to
Yeah.
sort through.
So, what would be some effective strategies for supporting loved ones as they're aging?
I think part of it is naming that, right? Naming that process and talking about it without trying to take it away. Because in this case of your friend, if he is feeling that rejection, there's some validity to it. There's some validity to it. So I think naming that and just kind
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
being with him and giving him that space to talk through it, I think that can be super useful for our loved ones. And I think we have to be careful too, because, there's this jump. I'm even thinking through conversations with my grandma when she was kind of losing some of her functioning and that sort of thing. And she would say, I feel very burdensome. I feel very useless. And my go-to was like, no, you're not burdensome. You're not, right. It was just to argue a little bit, well-intentioned,
Right.
but I wish I would have had the understanding to say, like, help me understand that a little bit more. And just to say, that is hard. That is hard. That sucks. And of course, look for opportunities to say, I still see a lot of value in you,
Hmm.
and our relationship and our connection still matters a great deal to me. But I do wish I would have had the opportunity and allowed myself just to say, tell me more. Just
Yeah.
let me in.
Well, I think, and a big part of it is, and we're not going to be able to change our society, but I think we can maybe recognize how society doesn't value the elderly. And other societies do, and past societies have, where elders were considered wisdom. They were valued. They were sought after. People went to them to ask for their advice. And this society where it's all about what you produce in terms of material things, people sometimes feel like they're not worthy anymore. And
Yeah.
so what I try to, like with my friend, I was like, you've earned this. Right? You have worked your whole life to get to this point. You've earned this. This is not a punishment. I would think about it as an opportunity. And it's really interesting because he turned around really quickly. I mean, in a few months. And I was talking to him a little bit later, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm starting to enjoy it." But
Yeah.
again, it's that shift in the perspective of from being rejected to now I have an opportunity.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Gains and losses, right? Yes. That rejection hurts and is painful, but what is it opening up for you? And again, day one, day two, probably wouldn't bring that up, but yeah, in time that becomes a lot
Right.
more easy to talk about. The phrase that I use in these circumstances, basketball was my sport, so I use a lot of basketball references.
Hmm.
But right when you come to that point where that something like that has happened, you can do a couple things. You can pivot, you can persist, or you can totally bow out, right? And for most people, that is not that one is like, no, I don't want to give up. I want to be a fighter, that sort of thing. And so it's like, okay, if you pivot, what does that look like? Because you're changing perspectives, you're giving yourself a different vantage point there. And if you're persisting, are you persisting in the way that you're still pursuing, right? You're still trying to get through that one barrier, or are you pivoting and persisting in another direction? So I always make sure persist doesn't mean just keep trying the exact same thing over and over again, but what does that persistence look like when you are able to pivot and see things from a different angle, see different openings?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. So how has perspective or the perception of grief changed over time, if it has? And what would you like for people to know about grief?
Awesome question. The first thing that comes to mind is a visual for me. And I often talk about how grief never goes away, as you and I have talked about, but it does change shape over time. It takes up different space around you.
Mm.
And of course, that can look different day to day, but I think that is a really important idea to think through, and as you said, there are certain anniversaries. I know for me in my life, there are certain full months that are just a lot harder.
Mm.
And I kind of recognize that, and I know, and now I kind of plan for it, and I get that that space is going to feel different. And it's exhausting to kind of prepare for that and know that that is coming. And I can't say that I love it or agree with it or even like it all that much a lot of the time. But I do think that is helpful, recognizing some of the cyclical or kind of temporary nature of some of the feelings. It is always there, but the intensity, I think, can be a little bit different. And that's a
Mhm.
message that's really important to send to people.
Yeah, I like that a lot, what you just said. I was thinking about it as you were talking, and the anniversaries, they feel the same, but they're also different. It's not as intense as it used to be. And it's really interesting because as we come up to the day, all my friends, they know it's coming, and then they're really well intentioned. They'll start sending me messages a week before, and I'm like, okay, so now not is it just the day? It's like a whole week that people are saying I'm going to be thinking about you and stuff. But also understanding the temporary nature of it, because I'm like, I know it's going to be intense on that day, and then the next day it'll be less intense. It'll be totally different tomorrow than it is today. And I used to suffer with seasonal affective disorder, and I live in Ohio, and the weather here is horrible in the winter. It's gray, and I struggled with it for years, and then finally got a light. I got a sad light, and I put it on my desk, and I was like, this is helping. And then one day I was like, you know what? I'm just going to deal with it. It's natural. It's a normal cycle of nature. I know it's going to be for a couple of months. Nature shuts down in the winter. The animals hibernate. The trees drop their leaves. Why do I feel like I should feel the same all the time? So I stopped using the light. And now, like in the winter, I hate the winter. It still sucks, but I'm like, but it's short, and it's shorter every year because the older you get, the faster time goes by. So I'm like, I can deal with it.
Yes, yes. Well, and that is something too. This idea of I can deal with it. I can adapt. I can, right? I can figure it out. And I find that so fascinating about the human condition, because I think about some of the things that people survive and live through.
Mhm.
And I'm like, wow, how did you do that? How do you do that day after day? And it's incredible to me. And so I think this idea of how can I be a little bit better? I almost bring in some sports like stuff in that
Mhm.
too, because it's like, what is this idea of, not that I'm going to be a perfect griever by any means, but what is this idea of continued improvement and kind of striving for excellence, and trying to make the life that I have left a bit more bearable, right? How do you deal with the unbearable, and really appreciate, have gratitude for the bearable, because that, even that feels very different after you've gone through a significant loss.
Yeah. Well, I think sports is a great analogy for lots of things. And as we go through these processes, we go through the pain of being human, the traumas, again, losses of people, but losses of all other types of things. I'll talk to people, and I believe that we're spiritual beings and that we're here having a human experience. And And I believe that we choose to come here, whether we choose each individual event or not. I think we choose, and people will say, "Well, I would never choose that. Why would I do that?" And I turn to sports and I say, "I would never run a marathon. I think it's insane for people to run 26 miles. I would never do a triathlon. That's insanity. But people do it because they want to test themselves. And it's painful. It's like it's not easy to do. It's like you're pushing your body, you're going through pain, but you're doing it because you feel like it's worth it. I try to tell people it's like when you're going through these grief events, think of it that way, that you are building these muscles, you're building these skills, you are going to come out of this eventually a better person than you were going into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And a more adaptable person nonetheless. Yeah. And I think grief, I wouldn't even compare it to a marathon. It's more of those, it's the ultras, it's the 50s, the 80s, 100, 200-mile races, just extends beyond
Yeah.
what we think we're capable of.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really great point, beyond what we think we're capable of, because when that event happens, and I've talked to so many people that have said, this is more than I can bear. And I was talking to someone the other day that said something about like, sometimes we get more than we can bear. And I say, if you're still here, it wasn't more than you could bear. It feels like it is. I know it felt like it did at the time,
Yeah.
but you've shown that it's not more than you can bear.
Yes, yes. Oh, and that's one of my very favorite concepts to play with is this idea of, I call it checking the facts. Um, Helping us recognize that sometimes we might feel something and our feeling is valid, but it doesn't necessarily fit the facts of the situation.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really helpful to kind of tear apart, what is what does the evidence tell us? What do my thoughts tell me? What do my feelings tell me? And I think looking at that with a critical eye sometimes can be really, really helpful. I mean, your feeling is still valid, but it doesn't necessarily fit the facts of the situation. And again, I think that can be quite freeing. And
Yeah.
then we can adapt and work with that feeling a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, because you said what you said there reminded me. I interviewed a guy who wrote a book, and he was feeling guilt after his mother passed away. And the guilt he was feeling was he didn't spend enough time with her.
Mm.
I should have spent more time with her in the hospital, et cetera. But he sat down and he kind of checked the facts. And he's like, I spent every moment I could with her. I couldn't have spent any more, time with her. But so he's like, so the facts are the same. I spent X number of hours with her. Now I can choose how I feel about it. I can tell myself this story, the story that I'm not a good son, that I wasn't there as much as I should have been, or I could tell myself the other story that I spent as much time with her as I could. Now, again, it's objective how many hours you spent with her, but it's subjective whether it was enough or not. And that's the choice that we get to make.
Yes, yes. Even that though, I could turn into a both and because it sounds like he spent as much time as he could and still didn't feel like it was enough. And with our most significant relationships, isn't that the case, right? We never feel like we can spend or like we can get enough time with as much as we pour into it. It's like, oh, there's always more and I'd like more. And like this person or this thing is just so important to me. So even that is a both and.
Yes, yeah, it absolutely is. And so, again, these things that are subjective, the things that are feelings, we can. I believe, I know, we can make choices. We can make choices how we look at it, and it may not seem that way at first, but when you talked about like checking the facts, I think that's so important. It's like, let me sit down and really think about this, and I'll talk to clients who feel guilty because they did do something or they didn't do something, and I will play out like both scenarios with them and say, if you had made the other decision and something happened, would you still feel the same way? So what it's people, and maybe you can explain to me why. It's like sometimes it's almost like we want to make ourselves feel bad. We will blame ourselves. We're harder on ourselves than we're on anybody else. We'll
Yes.
say I was a terrible parent because I let him walk to the park by himself, or I was a terrible parent because whatever. We fill in the blank.
Yes. Yes. The way I'm sure this is not the only way to think about this, but where my mind goes in those situations is that when we convince ourselves that we have control over something that we don't, that feels better than sitting with the uncertainty and the lack of control that we have in certain situations, right? So it's like, if I can tell myself that if I just would have done this one thing different, then the outcome would have been what I wanted, instead of saying, here's the process, I did everything I could, and this outcome still happened.
Yeah.
That is just so much harder to sit with, and there's so many more feelings than giving us the sense of control and blame.
Yeah, I
It's a
actually,
bit more cut and dry.
I kind of came to that conclusion. So I think you validated the conclusion I've come to, because I think it's a matter of control. We want to live in this illusion that we can control the world. So if we take ourselves retroactively and say, I had control over that situation, that means you have control over the future. So you don't have to give up this illusion of control. And to say that I didn't have any control also means I don't have control over the future. And that fear is greater than, well, I have to deal with the guilt now because it's my fault. And I've had people say to me, they'll say to me literally, well, obviously it's my fault because this happens. So clearly I made the wrong decision. I'm like, that's not true.
Yeah. It's an avoidance strategy, really.
Yeah. So hopefully we can help people to kind of pick these things apart, and to understand the reasons why we do the things that we do to basically self-sabotage, and help them, move through those things a little bit more easily. And I know you have some tools in your book that can help people, but they're not like, do these 3 things and you'll be okay in 6 weeks. So what types of things do you offer?
Yes, it's definitely, and I'm very upfront about that from the beginning. It's not a how-to book. There's not going to be this certain set of skills or steps to take, but throughout the book and in each chapter. So the way that it's set up is that I start with a narrative. So I talk through what the event is that I'm covering, and to create those narratives, I interviewed. So some of the stories, it's a multi-generational memoir. It's not just a personal memoir, because I look at people who have impacted me and their experiences, because all of that impacts who I am too, whether I was alive for an event or there for an event or not. And so I think that piece is really, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation we could get into, but I think that is really, really powerful and important. So I interviewed people to put the narrative together. And so the first part of each chapter is very raw, like, here is the narrative, here's what happened. And I infuse everyone's perspective to try to make it, as comprehensive and well-rounded as I can. The second part of each chapter is a bit of a synthesis. So it kind of goes through, and I incorporate education, I incorporate knowledge, I incorporate questions for the reader, but it's not academic. I don't cite research. It's not heavily footnoted or anything like that. I'm weaving that together in a way that anyone can just pick up and read and kind of put some dots together. And so through that synthesis, I encourage, I will pause in certain places and ask people, here's a series of questions for you to think about. How does this impact you? That sort of thing. So I weave some different interventions and things people can take away as I'm synthesizing.
Awesome. I think it's great. It sounds like it's very much needed, because we can help people. We can offer a little bit of guidance. We can come alongside them, but we can't chart the path for them. We can't offer them, a pill. And I guess maybe one of the last questions I want to ask you, because as we've talked about grief and what it is, and pretty recently or fairly recently, the DSM, I think it was the DSM-5, talked about prolonged grief disorder. And so, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is the second time I've been asked this question. It's a bit of a hot button for me. I understand, and I do think it's important that we look at how people are functioning. And if someone is truly being affected and functioning is being highly impacted, yes, we need to look at that, and we need to help people figure out how to, restore that or optimize that as best as we can. But I think to pathologize grief, which is something that never goes away, right? So if prolonged grief disorder, it's whatever, 6 months or whatever. So if I'm grieving for 6 months and 1 day, or 9 years later on the anniversary of your daughter's death, if you're upset today, that's pathological.
Yeah.
We'd have to diagnose you and prescribe you something for that. No.
Yeah.
No. So
Yeah.
I struggle with that a little bit. Again, I understand, and I think that's humans' goal and desire to categorize things or to cluster things in a way that makes it easy for our brain to digest. But grief is just tough to do that with. And so I struggle a bit with the diagnosis. I get its purpose.
Yeah. I
It does
think,
more harm
well,
than good, in my opinion.
yeah, again, back to that thing that things are complex. I think that I understand the purpose, and I understand if someone's like can't get out of bed and can't get to work and
Right.
stuff like that, okay, then fine, that we need to maybe intervene. But there's a danger of pathologizing grief, which I think is always a real danger. And the thing that when I heard about it that upset me the most was they're like, well, if we treat grief like an addiction, like just a drug addiction, then maybe we can find a pill that would cure it. And I'm
Yep.
like, if you think there's ever going to be a pill that's going to cure grief, you have no idea what grief is or human consciousness for that matter.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Which is a whole, and I make this point in the book. The goal is to help people understand that we cannot pathologize it, nor can we over medicate it.
Right.
And that's always something. I cannot tell you how many people have found their way into my office or their work with me and said, oh, well, I was prescribed A, B, C, and D because I was having a hard time sleeping, or I was having cognitive fog, or it's like, yeah, that's all grief.
Yeah.
I don't know that we need to throw medication at that. And again, I want to be very respectful of the impact on functioning and looking at some of those things. But I just think it does more harm than good. And we're also sending this message. You have 6 months to deal with all of that. If you're still feeling this way after that, then there is something wrong with you. And there isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for being here today. Remind people of where they can find you, and remind people about the name of your book.
Yeah, great question. So I'm in Denver, Colorado. That's where I live. And I am licensed in like 40 states as a psychologist.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I can work with people. And I even have on my website, npttherapy.com. You can check a little map to see if I would be able to work with you in your state. As far as the book goes, and she was never the same again.com is the website for that. You can get it on Amazon now. The audiobook just dropped last week, in fact. So it's ebook, paperback, and audio so far. And then socials, of course, I have Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. My Insta's at NPT Therapy.
All right. Natasha, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Enjoy your afternoon. Hey there, if you liked this episode, come on over and talk about it. Let me know what you liked. If you didn't like this episode, come on over and talk about it. Let me know what you didn't like. Go to grieftogrowth.com/community and look for Talk About the Podcast. I'll see you there.